praises for the ruling political elite. The Tot cultural group in Tanzania is a case in mind. But also, many artists in this country are hired during general elections and other political campaigns to sing praises for the contestants of parliamentary seats or the presidents. I remember during the 2015 general election, I was in Kerege in Bagamoyo, and I came across a dance group which was dancing vehemently in the hot sun and in a lot of dust. And they were singing praises for the candidate, their parliamentary candidate of that area. So when I asked why they were singing so many praises for this guy, one of them said this: "Mama, don't listen to what we are singing. For us, an election year is a harvest year. We sing their praises, they pay. We know that they will never come back here after they have won, and they will only come back for the next general election. Politicians don't care for us poor people. So we might as well eat a little of their money now." And those of you from Tanzania, you know that many songs are being used also in our general election. If I can give just one example, during the 2020 general election, you remember the song by Harmonize, the song Magufuli, which was converted from Kwangwalu, right? Was very extensively used for the presidential elections at that time. And such songs are used in many, many general elections. So here you can say that, again, we are producing sycophant art, or to use the term from the previous speaker, maybe this is chawa art. Now, besides this sycophant art, dominant classes also deliberately promote art which is supposedly politically harmless to their power. Government censorship units, such as the Tanzania National Arts Council, BASATA, are established to censor the artworks. As a result, artworks which thrive focus on frivolous topics, mostly love affairs, often couched in displays of promiscuity and vulgarity, or else the artworks deal with the themes which are devoid of any serious commentary or position on the struggles of the masses. Such art serves as some kind of opium to make people forget their wars and leave the ruling class alone. And we have a lot of such artworks in our countries. Many of these songs, or many of these artworks, if you listen to their content, it really doesn't say much. And I would like to cite one example, which all Tanzania who are here are aware of. And I want to quote the song which is trending now, has been trending for quite some time, by Mario. I think you know which one I mean. Yeah? Biatam. Biatam, Biatam. For those of you who are not conversant with Swahili, I'll just extract a few words from this song, just for you to see the meaninglessness of the content. It says, "Beer is sweet, beer is sweet. Don't let anyone tell you anything else. Beer is sweet, beer is sweet, beer is sweet. My baby, you are confusing my brain. Even when I'm at work, you rattle my brain. Let me enjoy life. Back then I was mistreated. Let me enjoy life. In the past, I was hurt. Life is short. If you frown, you will age. Don't frown, you will age. Don't be mean. You will die with it. Beer is sweet, beer is sweet, beer is sweet. Enjoy life. It is too short. Enjoy life. I'm asking who spilled my beer? I'm asking who spilled my beer? I'm already drunk. I am drunk. I'm totally drunk. I am drunk. I am drunk and don't know what is happening. I am drunk. Oh, I will pass out. I am drunk. Beer is sweet. Beer is sweet. Right? Mm-hmm. The back of this music, the back of pop music in East Africa really falls under this category. But it should be noted that even though we have this sycophant art and this politically harmless art, there is a huge repertoire of protest art which projects the voices and sentiments of the poor and marginalized classes. And such art is part of their continued struggle against forces that oppress and exploit them. For example, if you look at pop musicians, you can mention people like Fela Kuti of Nigeria, Ouma Sangare, Mali, Roman Catholic, Tanzania, Eric Wainaina, Oxy Pressure from Gidi Gidi from Kenya, Anselmo Raf of Namibia, and so on. Gidi Gidi's song, for example, Unbogable, became a popular expression of anger and defiance that helped remove President Arap Moi from power in 2002. Didier Awadi's song from Senegal, which is called Ma Waksoon Wakzit, I said it now, I take it back, led musicians in rallying the masses against Senegalese President Abdoulaye Wade attempt in 2012 to run for a third presidential term against the constitution. We also have, we can see we have political cartoons, we have posters, and different types of artworks which are also used very much in protest art, the protest art I'm talking about. But because time is running out, let me conclude by looking at Mwalimu Nyerere. Since this event is in honor of Mwalimu Nyerere's centenary, I wish to discuss very briefly Mwalimu's own application of the arts for the construction of national identity. This is with very specific reference to Ujamaa, the construction of Jamaa between 1987 and 1985. Soon after the announcement of the Arusha Declaration, Mwalimu called the poets to State House and requested them to go and publicize the Arusha Declaration. And indeed, many poems were constructed as a result of that request. One poet, Matthias Mnyampara, even came up with a special poetic genre known as Ngonjera. And this Ngonjera was constructed as a new genre specifically to publicize the Arusha Declaration. And in this Ngonjera, normally you have two sides to the debate, a protagonist who supports Ujamaa and an antagonist who speaks against Ujamaa, but in the debate, in the end, the protagonist always wins. But Mwalimu Nyerere and his government at that time used all types of the arts to propagate Ujamaa and self-reliance. Indeed, most of the Ujamaa policies actually found ways in the artworks. You can actually trace the history of Ujamaa by simply looking at the songs and the poems and the taarab and the different art forms which were constructed in that period, because they covered all policies, all statements on Ujamaa. It is debatable whether this use of the arts by Mwalimu Nyerere was good or bad. One view sees such use as mere political propaganda, which should not have been done, but another view sees such use as necessary to Mwalimu's effort to inculcate the required mindset for Tanzanians to accept and practice Ujamaa. Now, whether you accept, whether you are on one side of the argument or the other, the truth is that this use of the arts during the Ujamaa era helped to inculcate among Tanzanians the ideals, values, and attitudes and mindset required by the Ujamaa and self-reliance ideology. And it can be said that an Ujamaa culture and Ujamaa identity premised on the values of equality, human rights, human dignity, unity, and people-centered development was, to a certain extent, constructed. We dare claim that by the time Mwalimu voluntarily relinquished power in 1985, he left a country whose national identity was identifiable as leaning towards Ujamaa. Tanzanians were largely identified as a people with a strong belief in the values of human dignity, unity, peace, equality, and respect for all human beings. Unity held them together as a nation, regardless of ethnicity, color, or social standing, and human dignity made them feel equal as a people to anybody, and thus enabling them to peacefully coexist with people from all walks of life. Now, although these were very noble values and they were already being identified with the Tanzanian identity, the intensification of capitalism has led to an increasingly process of these values being eroded and being replaced by capitalism. In conclusion, I want to say, as the country grapples with the impact of intensified capitalism and imperialism, we see many Tanzanians, particularly the young ones, hankering for the Western way of life. Some young parents are even forbidding their children to speak Kiswahili, their national language. Some people are replacing their African names by names from foreign countries, and many artists, unfortunately, are content to suppress their creativity and become mere copycats of Western artistic creations. It is our contention that other African countries are facing similar predicaments. And if we substitute the word colonialism with capitalism and imperialism, we can say that Mwalimu's statement in 1962 is as relevant today as it was then. And I want to quote him once again with the substituted words: of all the crimes of capitalism and imperialism, there is none worse than the attempt to make us believe that we have no indigenous culture of our own, or that what we have is worthless, something we should be ashamed of, instead of being a source of pride. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe you now understand why I said at the beginning that I thought I was crazy to accept to speak to this topic, for indeed the question still stands. What is African identity, and how can we today construct an African identity? Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Mlama, for that detailed, very important reminiscent of what has happened to this particular moment in terms of the arts. Now I would like to welcome Amil Shivji to give us his take on film and the arts. Karibu sana.
Hello? Okay. Figured this. Thank you so much, Dr. Mona. Thank you for the introduction earlier. Unita kijana mchachari lakini mbona mpole sana. Um, the presentation that you just gave, Professor Mlama, is actually, I find it very, very humbling and slightly embarrassed, because I feel like you've covered everything that I just wanted to say. So I feel a bit more confident about my thoughts now and my ideas. But I think I'm going to speak a little bit about film and African identity from the perspective as an artist, as a filmmaker and as a working artist right now in our so-called industry and in our struggling economy for the arts. The word identity, especially in today's environment, can cause a bit of a flutter in any room of intellectuals, progressives, or otherwise. It's a term that creates headlines, starts discussions, and ends them all at once. The African identity can be hotly contested based on various elements of definition. To build an identity, we have to have an ideology, a language. And I'm not talking about a grammatical language. I'm talking about a language that coincides with a way of thinking. Otherwise, we fall into the tropes of stereotypical copy-paste images that founded their success in the economies of scale of starved local markets, or the NGO-led poverty-stricken narrative with a taste of mosquito nets, dictatorship, and GMO farms. Through these images, the world has created an African iconography that for a long time was not only grotesquely misrepresentative, but also extremely repressive. Such images of what meant to be Africa and African catered to the sensibilities of the imperialist agenda, an Africa that needed to be saved. As of recent, the liberal take has been the extreme opposite. It has been one of creating a positive image of Africa, one with skyscrapers, tucked-in shirts, and business meetings. Such images do not drift too far away from the savior narrative. The Africa that was once in need of saving has been completely infantilized. It is now like an infant aspiring to the image of the developed West. As a creator of moving images myself, I can't help but notice the irony in how our images are still pigeonholed into one-dimensional representation that remove our complexities and nuances as a people. Images that blur the contradictions of everyday life and living and reduce an entire people with constantly evolving and complex societies into simple reflections of imperialist agendas. During the peak of the Africa Rising phenomenon, when local billionaires were celebrated in foreign trade magazines, I made a short film called Samaki Mchangani, and the English title was Fish of the Land. Samaki Mchangani critiqued that very notion, an idea that built its thesis around a facade of development and progress for the few elites on the backs of the many poor. The very definition of development was skewed from the start. The conversations that were being had in public spaces were unjust and idolized the Walionacho. We looked at them as stars to aspire to. When we screened Samaki Mchangani in open spaces, in the city and in rural areas, across festivals and across the world, the response, especially on the continent of Africa, was very telling. Spectators spoke about their struggles with the state and the arms of authority, the many struggles they had facing issues of land grabbing, their voices not being heard, and barely surviving on the margins of society. I remember when I screened the film in Milmani City, we invited everybody who had partook in the film, including some of the security guards that were there on location. One of them came to me at the end of the film and was crying and had tears rolling down his cheeks. And I wasn't sure what I had done wrong. And he spoke to me because in the film, at the end of the film, we use archival footage of Operation Bomoa Bomoa, if you remember. And he showed me a shot that we used from the ITV footage. That was one of his houses that was broken down, demolished during that time. So in that immediate moment, we realized how the film spoke to not only an individual's experience, but to an individual's struggle. Spectators, the spectators didn't identify with the protagonist in the film, who lives a very rich life handed to him on a silver platter and believes in slaving away for the nation. They identified with the struggle of the working people. Their voice, their sense of being in this world was defined through struggle, ever evolving and ever concrete. Amilcar Cabral wrote, "Culture is simultaneously the fruit of a people's history and a determinant of history. One cannot talk of identity without speaking of culture. However, the question is, or perhaps maybe should be, whose culture? And what social relationships are determinant and produced through such culture? A people's culture is not set in stone. As Professor Mlama clearly spoke about the modes of production, and a fishing village is going to create a fishing culture. How can it be when we are faced with contending interests within our societies that we talk about one kind of culture? When these clashing interests are between the majority of who are oppressed, who survive on hope and struggle, against a minority who are privileged, who thrive in the oblivion of representation, we must decide as a people what is our definition of culture, hence identity. To give a simple example, is our culture defined simply by what we wear, by the clothes on our backs, or by the struggles of those who produce the cloth and the songs they sing when they are stitching these clothes together? Our people have cultivated a culture of resilience and resistance over time. For any human being to be free, they have a right to know their history, to tell their stories of their survival. It is in this space that I truly believe culture resides, in the dignity of a people. Colonialism took that away from us. It robbed us of the tools to record our histories during that time. While I was researching for a recent film, I found myself in the archives of Zanzibar, looking for visual references of the island during the 1950s, during colonialism. And I did find pictures. To my surprise, actually, I was quite happy when I heard the director of the archives telling me that they had found pictures during that period. And I found them, and then I went and started going through them and looking at the files. All those pictures showed me were the railway that was used for extraction, the clove plantations, and a few pictures of white colonialists swimming around the English Club. The colonialist behind the camera, who now, today, holds the power of history telling, was motivated by his colonial interests. He viewed the subject of his photographic gaze and how that subject is represented, or actually entirely omitted from us today. Zanzibar's recorded visual history is defined by the absence of Zanzibari people. Leaving the archives, I decided to do a bit more research, and I was working with a research assistant, and we found out about a Hollywood film called West of Zanzibar. I don't know if some of you have watched it or have had the terrible experience of watching it. It's in 1954, quite a famous film during that time, and is around 15 minutes shot in Zanzibar. And again, we had an opportunity to have a visual representation of the 1950s in Zanzibar in color, because none of the pictures that we got were in color. So this was in color. And we found the 15 minutes. It was mostly in Stone Town, Mjimkongwe. And we would watch it over and over and over again. And this time actually moving frame by frame, second by second, so we could see what they were wearing, what the streets looked like, what the production design would look like, so we could implement it in our film. And that process, without realizing for me and my research assistant, became extremely horrendous and traumatic, because we kept watching these 15 minutes that was a representation of black and brown Zanzibari people through a colonialist gaze. And we had to endure this over and over and over again because there was no other visual representation of our time and our people. And in that time, you're re-traumatizing yourself. A very violent process, let me tell you. Leaving the archives, I started going to smaller, less imposing settings, meeting Zanzibari people themselves. And we started to find an entirely different story unfold. We met some of the children and grandchildren of the Zanzibari photographers who had studios at that time, and we saw the staged portraits of Zanzibari people who told us a completely different narrative. A story of young women dressed up in their best attire and serenaded in the finest jewelry, facing the camera with a prop in hand. Another picture with a little girl hiding behind her older sister, but cheekily smiling at this new contraption called a camera. I even found a picture of my grandmothers as young women showing off their prowess as their calmness and grandeur took over the frame. Their images were recorded with the dignity that they deserved. If I can pull inspiration from some of the filmmakers that have really made me who I am today, from the 1960s, identity and culture was at the forefront, things that we're talking about today, but not in a matter of a neoliberal perspective where we're looking at the individual idea of freedom, but rather as a political tool and not a representational instrument. They made films that had primary themes of social justice, alienation, the urban-rural divide, military rule, tradition and modernity, and most importantly, Pan-Africanism. Usman Semben, the father of African film, called cinema a political instrument of action. There was intention and purpose when African cinema spoke to a socially conscious cause. It wasn't some NGO-funded idea. It sought to identify with the marginalized audience. I would argue it pushed even further than identification. Rather, it radicalized its audience and allowed, indeed forced, room for discomfort. In a different context, Frantz Fanon is quoted as saying that every spectator is a coward or a traitor. Fanon was alluding to the question of struggle. How can one be so privileged as to merely be a spectator when the contradictions of society are a matter of basic human survival and dignity for most? When it comes to cinema, the audience must be active. In order to avoid reducing the viewer to a spectator, it is the responsibility of the artist to engage, involve, and move the audience. Hollywood, especially classical Hollywood cinema, had a tradition of creating escapist cinema, which pacifies the audience and steers them away from social realism, questioning the status quo, or even having a critical look into society's blemishes. Hollywood has thrived on the seemingly passive filmmaker that brainwashed the people into believing the witch hunt for the left or the radical, villainizing those who were honest about the exploitative system, and valorizing the arms of coercion and exploitation. The pious and the police were always right. If I can recall the HUAC, the House of Un-American Activities from the 1950s, its entire job was to blacklist any progressive ideas, blacklist any leftist filmmakers and writers, and they ended careers. And in that way, that tradition of filmmaking has stayed till today of maintaining the status quo. Some of the biggest funders of Hollywood is the American military. As an African filmmaker, our practices must question the passive role of the spectator in the dominant film culture. We must create what Manthia Diawara has coined the resistant spectator, who has become an active critic, birthing a dialectic dialogue with film. This is how I see film spectatorship and identity in cinema. It is critical for us as Africans to engage with cinema as a tool of liberation. to liberate our minds from the shackles of colonial domination, imperialist ideas of Africa and Africans, but also to create a site of solidarity. When we screen our films in the rural areas, or even in the city sometimes, but in open spaces, we get up to 3,000-4,000 people attending to watch the film. And they come in there, and in that space immediately becomes a site of liberation. Mental liberation, but also for them to come together. What I think in colonial law would be illegal, because it's a gathering of over 15 people, suddenly becomes a site of education and entertainment. When we make films, we must think of the social and historical constitution of the spectator. Because in Tanzania, we talk a lot about the audience. With my recent film especially, we constantly get questions from the media about, is this film too developed for the audience? Is it too complicated for the audience? A question I find very problematic, because our audience should not be undermined. We should not ever underestimate our audiences. They know more than we do. They're on the ground, we're not. Western and European ideologies are produced, reiterated, regurgitated, recycled, and refurbished through their cinema. These ideologies were not repressive to our people, are still limited in their practice. Their lack of resonance with our culture as a space of resistance and a site of liberation creates a gap between film and spectator. I'm not arguing against fantasy, surrealism, and fiction. Rather, I'm very much for it. However, they must be within the context of our cultures of resistance. The film I've talked about a couple of times, and Dr. Mona kindly spoke about as well, called Bhutarika, is based on Adam Shafi's novel of the same name. It is set in Zanzibar in the 1950s, a time under British colonial rule. And during the editing process, a usual activity that we do is share the film with people who haven't seen the film or haven't read the novel to get a different perspective. So I did share the film with various gatekeepers of the African arts world who live in the West, many of whom are white, by the way. One of the comments that really stood out to me was, why isn't there more violence in the film? So we can see how bad colonialism is. I have now shown this film at least 20 festivals, screened hundreds of people every day at Mlimani City. We had over 1,200 people in Zanzibar at the premiere, awards, etc., etc. But I've never heard that comment from a person of color. The trauma of colonialism, its violence, it lives with us every day. It's living with us right now as we sit in this room and talk about it. Even if the part of it that we vehemently resist, it has become part of our culture. And it is unnecessary to remind ourselves or re-traumatize our people with colonial violence. If I need to tell you how bad colonialism was or how violent it was, then we have a bigger problem. Any singular definition fixes a reality without evolution or progress. If I may offer a short, quick story while I'm here, although I know I'm running out of time. In my first year university in Toronto, Canada, at York, I was on the verge of quitting after 3 months. The reason being, I felt out of place in the world I was being introduced to. I couldn't understand why I was watching or spending months studying European cinema and World War I, while being halfway across the world from my birthplace. Knowledge is always a benefit, there's no question about that. But I was not ingesting anything that I could actually implement when I would come back to Tanzania. It was almost as if the professors around me were training me to live in the West. So that is exactly what I told the head of my department, and at the time he just shrugged his shoulders in agreement. As I was about to leave, I called my father, and I told him, please be at the airport, I'll be arriving at this time. And he mentioned to me I should give it a couple more weeks just to finish the semester. During that time, I put in my application to the University of Cape Town for a double major in mass communication and journalism. And I still believe I would have made a good journalist. I was about to do that, and the head of department told me about a second-year course called African Cinema, which had just been scrapped due to budget cuts. Of course, when the budget gets slashed, it's Africa and the arts that goes first. They provided me with the entire syllabus, and one thing about the West is that they have amazing resources, even when those resources are from and about us. I ended up visiting the library every week borrowing a film that was in the syllabus and photocopying the reading material. Reading material which I use till today and I was using when I was teaching here at the university. When I couldn't find it there, they would order it for me. I got introduced to Mambeti, Usman Semben, Sarah Maldoror, Gasun Kabore, Abdurrahman Sissako, watched films like Borom Saret, Khala, La Petite Vendeuse de Soleil. I realized these are the stories I wanted to tell. And these are the stories I could relate to. They had been told from the 1960s onwards as soon as an African could pick up a camera or had to force themselves close to a camera. That is when I realized this is what I wanted to do. I wanted to do the same thing. Go against the grain, pick up a camera and tell stories from my perspective. To be honest to the people around me. To be humble. Camera lenses can be very aggressive. It can attack. And that is how Africa has been portrayed in film. But what if the lens is a long-lost friend? One that it was humbled in the presence of the subject, nostalgic of their story, and romantic about a future. What if it could actually highlight the beauty of our continent, of our relationships, of our struggles and solidarity? That is the path I believe I've chosen. Chatterjee writes, the most powerful as well as the most creative results of the nationalist imagination in Asian Africa are posited not on an identity, but rather on a difference with the modular forms of national society propagated by the modern West. In the same vein, it is crucial to build a cinematic language that does not imitate Western and European ideals, both in form and content, as that would be a disservice to our everyday realities. This cinematic language, one of resistance, is an anti-colonial language of love. It will allow us to define our identity, an ever-evolving one that speaks to our past and creates an authentically just future. Third cinema. It has existed in our past and now it is time for a new wave. African cinema is on an exciting journey, resisting a foreign idea and building a diverse identity that speaks for itself. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for your time.
Thank you very much, Amil, for taking us through your experience, you as a filmmaker, and what has brought you to a point of using the camera to be able to speak the language of anti-colonial, but anti-resistance, but with love, with the reality of Africa and Tanzania. Thank you for that. Let's just give them another hand of applause, please, before we open the floor. Thank you very much. Now I would like to open the floor for any questions that you have to the filmmakers, to these young, critical, defiant individuals here on stage. Okay, thank you. Microphone, there's a hand over there. Kule? Yes, pale mwanzo kabisa alafu.
Asante. My name is Dr. Eleanor Tarokoidian. I work with Haki Elimu. I'm a Tanzanian, by the way. Nimesoma hapa kuanzia primary mpaka nimemaliza kidato cha 6 alafu nimeenda kusoma nje. Kwa nini nimetamka my introduction? Ni kwa sababu I want to relate to the two speakers. Professor Penina, amazing. I listened to you from the beginning to the end. You spoke to us, to the generations of Mwalimu Nyerere era up to now. And then I was asking myself while listening to you, where did we go wrong? What happened to our culture? How do we identify ourselves as Tanzanians? Because theater is the expression of our culture. Theater is the expression of how we feel. And today, every street that you drive through or walk through in this country, not only Dar Es Salaam, up country, mimi nasafiri sana mikoani. Trust me, there are bars every corner you go, but not a single theater that one would want to go and watch a play, spend an evening and see something that is cultural. I am blessed to have been sometime in my life to grow outside this country where theater was the driving force of the language, of the culture, of civilization, of the ethics. I am who I am today because of theater. And I would like to encourage Tanzanian youth not to use only theater for development, which is used expressively and quite extensively in the projects that we do, including Hakelimu, but also use theater in our lives every single day, and encourage usage of Kiswahili books, turn them into the performance. Tutajuaje Kiswahili kama hatukifanyi hicho Kiswahili kikawa ndio chimbuko la tamaduni yetu, kufanya maigizo ambayo yakaita jamii, yakafundisha wananchi, ikafundisha vijana, ikatubadilisha fikra zetu, lakini ikatufanya sisi wa Tanzania tuwe wazalendo. Uzalendo tunajua ni kutambua historia yetu tulikotoka, lakini uzalendo inatokana na sisi kusoma vitabu na kukuza lugha yetu, ambayo itakuwa mojawapo ni kutumia sanaa ya maonyesho. I'm going to Shivji. Asante. Shivji, you touched on the movies. Another very important element, and I'm again asking myself, what happened to those beautiful cinema halls that were there when we were growing up? And there was a Tanzanian movie made by Tanzanians, I think in their 60s or early 70s, called Mlevi. I don't know if those generation may have seen that movie. It's a very, very humble film, and it touches about our culture, who we are, and how we need to live as Tanzanians, as the people, as the community. What happened to that? Our movies today are the movies of, I don't want to call it the new generation, no, it's not that, but of the selected few. Not everyone can watch all the movies that we see. And there is one thing that I heard in your conversation talking about colonialism and leaving us with, I would call it not aggressive, but painful past. On the other side, I want to disagree with you, because if I look at the Western Africa, the Francophone, colonialism in Francophone Africa left a very beautiful culture of cinema, theater, music. They are people who portray the arts in everything that they do. So maybe we need to look at who was the colonialist. Was it the Anglophone who focused on education and not on culture and ethics, or the Francophone that focused on culture, cinema, and other attributes, but probably not so strong in education? Those are the two attributes. Thank you.
Thank you. That person over there. Naomba mpe huyo hapo, alafu tutakuja huku.
Thank you. Na mambo mawili kabla sijatoa mchango. Jambo la kwanza ni kutoa pongezi kwa Chuo Kikuu cha Dar es Salaam, na to be specific Professor Rekaza Mkandala na baadaye Professor Isa Shivji. Mimi ni kati ya watu waliokuwepo mwanzoni kabisa wakati Kigoda kinaanza mwaka 2009, na kuwa hapa leo nimefarijika sana kukuta kwamba Kigoda kinaendeleza kazi ya kuendeleza mawazo ya Mwalimu Nyerere katika masuala ya umajumui wa Afrika. Kwa hiyo nakipongeza sana Chuo Kikuu cha Dar es Salaam. Jambo la pili ni nije kwenye mchango wa swala la utambulisho. Sio kama ni lugha sahihi. Africa's identity. Napata shida sana kwamba sisi kama wa Afrika, maana hapa tunafanya reflection of the present and future of the African continent with regard to 100 years of Julius Nyerere, the one that we know was a true son of Africa and a pan-Africanist in practice and also in preaching. Now, sisi wa Afrika, nafikiri mara nyingi wazungu wanatutizama sisi katika identity ya umoja, wakati sisi tukirudi huku Afrika tunajitazama katika mataifa 54 kama alivyosema profesa hapo mwanzo. Je, ukienda Ulaya au kaenda Marekani, if you go to North America or you go to the continental Europe, ukiwauliza wazungu ufanye utafiti, watakwambia Afrika ina nchi ngapi? They know nothing. Wanajua Afrika ni nchi, wengi wao wanajua Afrika ni nchi. Lakini sisi Afrika tunahangaika na hivi vinchi vidogo vidogo ambavyo Mwalimu alisema hivi ni vikabila vidogo vidogo. Tunapaswa Afrika tufike sehemu tukubali identity ya wenzetu ya kutuona sisi Afrika kama moja. Kwa hiyo mimi ninapenda kwamba going forward, the only way for us to liberate Africa, the only way for African continent to continue ni kujenga umoja wa Afrika, na napongeza serikali za Jumuiya ya Afrika Mashariki kwa kuonesha njia. Tanzania ilianza mwaka 64 kwa kuunganisha Tanganyika na Zanzibar, na Mwalimu Nyerere akasimamia pamoja na Karume kutengeneza taifa.
Asante.
Sawa. Kwa kumalizia, asante sana. Naomba niulize swali kwa okay, thank you very much. Let me end up.
Asante. Naomba tutumie muda kidogo, kama tuna swali tuulize. Taja jina lako, uliza swali. Naomba mkono ulikuwa hapa kwanza.
Asante sana. Majina naitwa Sami Oscar Mkemwa, so I want to contribute to this key question. As far as African culture is concerned,
Nitaahidi iwe fupi, lakini naomba muda
okay.
umetutupa
as
sana.
far as African culture is concerned, we must follow the advice of our ancestors. So you beautiful children of Africa, we must follow the ancestors, the advice of Ngungi wa Thiong'o. We must go and learn the ways of white man, but do not be like a white man. Go and learn the ways of Chinese man, but do not be like a Chinese man. Go and learn the ways of Arab man, but not be like Arab man. Because once you know they behave and they think, you will be able to avoid their dangerous activities, and at the end of the day, will be able to sit at the dinner table of civilization as the diners and not waiters of food. So by doing so, one day the Africa will manipulate the Western culture.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. My name is Elijah Kondi, faculty member at University of Dar Es Salaam. Mine is a comment. Professor Biatamu actually won award a Song of the Year, so it should tell you a lot, about what you are talking about. It won an award as a Song of the Year, so it should tell you a lot about the organizing committee and the culture that you are living on. But I want to also talk about the film industry. Right? One of the things that, for example, the America have succeeded a lot is about passing their civilization and the history from generation to generation through film. And they were able to recreate the story that kids were being told when they're young into blockbuster movie. When you talk of comic and how they recreated the movie, and that they're able to influence even in our context. Our kids nowadays are more identified with the Spider-Man than our own heroes. So my point was, how can we use the film in order to tell our own stories? When we grew up, there are a lot of good stories that we had. For example, I'd love to watch a movie about Mwana Malundi, right? When I was young, I would listen to Mama na Mwana, their cultivating story. I would love to watch a movie about that. So in order to pass, earlier in the morning we talk about importance of history as an instrument to pass the Pan-Africanism spirit. How can we use the film to do that? Because nowadays, people want to be entertained, but also being educated, right? I think we can use that in order to pass that story through film industry. Thank you.
Thank you very much. One last hand. Kule nyuma.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I greet you, my elders. So far, many questions have been asked. My name is Jennifer Fred Nteleke, a first-year student in the taking course of Bachelor of Arts in Sociology. So far, I would like to acknowledge the presentation that has been made by Professor Penina Mlama and also Mr. Amil Shivji. On the matter of the Vuta Nkuvute work, I've read it once I was in advanced level, and I was so grateful to see that it has been acted and displayed in the Cinemax, and some of the people whom I know attended, and they were so proud to see that work there. So I would like us to give a round of applause to the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you. With those remarks, I would like to turn to our panelists. Some of them were comments, but I'm sure there were some questions that you could kindly
Thank you very much. Actually, most of them were comments, and we appreciate the comments very much. Maybe the only question came from my young sister from Hakelim, when you were asking where did we go wrong, and the example you are giving of the absence of theater houses in the country. There is one explanation to the absence of theater houses in Tanzania as compared to the presence of theater houses, for example, in Uganda or in Kenya. They do have quite a lot theater houses, and they have a very active theater going culture in terms of actually going to a building to go and watch theater. Our history and the absence of theater houses can be explained by the fact that as early as 1967, when the Arusha Declaration was declared, there was a very heavy emphasis on relevance of education. And the theater houses were associated with the European type of theater. After that pronouncement of education for self-reliance and the demand that our education should be relevant to Tanzania, there was a lot of effort put on reviving the African, the Tanzanian indigenous theater forms. And the focus was on looking at the dances, storytelling, poetry, and all those forms which were indigenous to the country. Unfortunately, the revival of those theater forms were not associated with the construction of theater houses. So I think we were satisfied with reviving the dances and performing them in their natural context, in the wide, the open air arena, wherever, in the village, and the tree, or wherever. So the only performances that now went into the theater houses are the ones which were done in the cities using the theater houses which the colonial masters left. Now, I don't know whether that was a positive development or not, but actually that explains that kind of history. So if you go all over Tanzania, you don't find theater houses. I think the rest were comments. They're not questions. Thank you very much, at least to me. Thank you.
Thank you. Amir?
Thank you. Very similarly to what Professor Mlama talked about in terms of the cinema houses regarding your question, it's really been quite sad, the developments of where to exhibit your film. And that's one of the biggest questions we always have. In Dar es Salaam, for example, there's only one chain that exists that has completely monopolized exhibition of cinema. And if you don't work in line with their principles and their guidelines, then you just can't show your film in a cinema. And doing open air screenings is not as easy as it sounds, because the powers that be require quite a few licenses and permits and police permits and et cetera, and guidelines based on censorship and rating. So it's not as easy as we want it to be to watch a movie. And something that has really proliferated in the past 10 years or so is Vibanda Umiza, which is the small kiosk, video kiosk, where they show films for 100, 200 shillings. It's also the pitfall for a lot of films because it's the epitome of piracy. So you don't make any money as a filmmaker, but your film gets seen. I think there's something to learn from those Vibanda Umiza, because they're able to screen the film to many people and get a mass audience. It's just about finding a way where the filmmaker is actually able to partake in it and not being robbed from those screenings. But I do see there's a movement now with streaming services to make films more accessible. And I think there is a moment where we as spectators and audiences have to push our cinema houses to screen local films, because it's still quite hard to convince them. At the end of the day, they're running a business, and they're always looking at their profit margin. But regarding your second comment about colonialism, leaving a beautiful culture of the arts in the Francophone part of Africa, I really have to disagree respectfully. I don't think colonialism has left anything beautiful in any part of the world. It has always had a motive of extraction. So if you think about it, there's a very familiar argument. Look, colonialism gave us roads and railways, but the railways was from the Shamba to Bandarin. It was extracted. It wasn't for us to get on it for transportation. It was to take away raw materials and resources from the continent. Very similarly in the arts. Ousmane Sembène, who we call the father of African cinema, didn't start making films because he was given a camera by a Frenchman. He walked around French sets and picked up the remaining celluloid that was left on the ground, stuck it together, and used that for his films. It was his own initiative as a Senegalese man, and then made those films in Wolof, in their indigenous language. So it is the resistant spectator. It is the active, it is the action of a filmmaker or an artist living under these colonial regimes under oppression to make these films in response to the oppression that they're facing. So I don't think there's a difference between the Anglophone and Francophone colonialism, and I can even speak to the current situation, to the neo-colonial situation right now. You know, when you make a film, especially an African film, they tell you the biggest international market that you're ever going to find is France. They're going to be the biggest audience for you. So even your films, they always advise you, put French subtitles, because you're going to get an audience there. And you question, why would you get an audience there? And it's because of what you alluded to, the Francophone, right, the culture. Under Senghor, the Senegalese sometimes were more French than the French themselves, because they wanted that idea of development, that idea that they wanted to arise to, which was one of being French, a French citizen, and being assimilated in French culture. But assimilation is horrendous. Assimilation is robbing yourself of your own culture, of your own identity. So I think looking at it in that way, in that context, then it'll be very hard for me to agree with the fact that they left anything beautiful. I think it was all quite miserable. And then the other comment from over there about how can we use film to tell our stories, I mean, that very way, let's use film to tell our stories. Film is a medium, and one of the most beautiful things about it is that it uses all the arts. You have music, you have writing, literature, you have special effects, you have acting. So film is incapable of reaching what it wants to reach without incorporating all the arts. So I think it's one of the best ways to tell stories, to be honest. I'm biased, obviously, because I'm a filmmaker. But for the other reason is that it reaches the masses quicker. Another quote from Sembène is that, you know, he started off by writing literature, and he was an amazing writer. And why did he move to film? And that was a question he kept being asked over and over and over again by European journalists. And he simply said it was the best way to get to the people. My books were not being read because majority of his audiences were literate, but the films they could watch. And even today in Tanzania, we consume film like no other person. We watch Korean films, we watch Mexican films, we watch Filipino films, we watch Brazilian films, we watch Indian films and English films without subtitles, because these subtitles are not even in Kiswahili. It's only recently that they started dubbing, very recently. But for years we were watching these films. Because film is a language of the people. It's a universal language. So through film and through moving images, we can tell stories. And it's very exciting because right now, even in the Department of Creative Arts, in the film and television program, there are up to 500 students pursuing a bachelor's degree in film and television, which means in a couple of years you're going to have students with bachelor degrees in film on the street looking for work, but also telling their stories, which I think is really, really exciting, and we're giving them the tools to do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amil. Film is a tool to tell stories, and you also said culture resides in the people and the dignity of the people. And I would like to leave you with that statement that culture resides in the dignity of the people, and it's upon us. The question is as complex as Professor Mlama has said, but it's upon us to understand where we have been, where we are, and where can we move forward. And with those few words, I would like to end this session and give it back to Dr. Munisi to give us any information in terms of what needs to be done and when are we starting tomorrow. Again, thank you very much. Let's just give one hand for the panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mona and Mr. Amil and Professor Mlama. Asante sana. What an exciting, interesting, enlightening panel that was to wrap the day. So,
just one more. I would like to say about Professor Mlama, she was the former Mwalimu Julius Nyerere Chair in Pan-Africanism. So that's another one.
Thank you very much then. Mwanafunzi na mwalimu wake, do you think that she will not grade your paper with an A+ if you did not introduce her again? Thank you very much. So thank you very much for being patient. As you can see, time is not our best ally, but you are all here. So I should thank you very much because we all rose to the occasion. The listeners rose to the occasion today. Panel chairs rose to the occasion. Presenters rose to the occasion. Even the caterers rose to the occasion, as well as washroom cleaners. Asante sana. We begin tomorrow at 9 sharp. I wish you a very restful evening. There is no any announcement to be made.